Imagine you're watching a historical drama where the Roman Empire has spent 6 centuries dying in increasingly creative ways. You've seen barbarian invasions, plague pandemics, religious revolutions, and imperial fragmentations. You think you know how this story ends, with Europe slowly evolving into a collection of Christian kingdoms that occasionally remember they used to be Roman. Then, just when you've settled into your medieval mindset, someone completely rewrites the script. Someone who's never heard of Caesar, doesn't care about Constantine, and thinks Rome is just another city to be conquered. Someone who shows up with a new book, a new god, and a new way of organizing civilization that makes the last 6 centuries of European politics look like a practice run. Welcome to the 7th century Anno Domini, when the Mediterranean world discovered that while Europeans had been arguing about who got to inherit Rome's legacy, the people who were actually going to inherit it had been quietly organizing in the desert. This is the century when everything changed so fast that by 700 Anno Domini, the phrase Roman Empire meant something completely different than it had meant in 600 Anno Domini. Here are 10 mind-blowing facts about the century that prove the real plot twist in Roman history wasn't the fall of Rome. It was the rise of Islam. Fact number 1. An illiterate merchant from Arabia conquered more territory than Caesar in 20 years. Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born around 570 Anno Domini in Mecca, a trading city that most Romans couldn't have found on a map. By the time he died in 632 Anno Domini, he had united the Arabian Peninsula under a new religion and launched a conquest that would, within a century, control territory from Spain to India. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The Arabian Peninsula was a backwater filled with nomadic tribes who spent most of their time fighting each other over water rights and caravan routes. The Byzantine and Persian empires, which controlled the civilized world, regarded Arabs as useful mercenaries and occasional trading partners, but not as a serious military threat. Muhammad changed this by doing something unprecedented. He convinced Arab tribes that their traditional tribal loyalties were less important than loyalty to Allah and His messenger. Instead of fighting each other, Arab tribes should unite to spread Islam to the entire world. The early Islamic conquests moved with a speed that would have made Alexander the Great jealous. Damascus fell in 635 Anno Domini. Jerusalem surrendered in 638 Anno Domini. The entire Persian Empire collapsed by 651 Anno Domini. By 642 Anno Domini, Muslim armies had conquered Egypt, the richest province of the Byzantine Empire. What made this conquest so remarkable wasn't just its speed, but its permanence. Unlike previous barbarian invasions, which often dissolved after the death of a charismatic leader, the Islamic expansion created stable administrative systems that lasted for centuries. The Arabs succeeded where other conquerors had failed, because they offered something new, a religious and political system that transcended tribal, ethnic, and linguistic divisions. You didn't have to be Arab to be Muslim, and you didn't have to abandon your local customs to join the Islamic world. By 661 Anno Domini, the Umayyad Caliphate controlled more territory than the Roman Empire at its peak. The center of Mediterranean civilization had shifted from Constantinople and Rome to Damascus and eventually Baghdad. Fact number 2. The Byzantine Empire lost 2/3 of its territory and pretended nothing had happened. The Byzantine response to losing Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and North Africa, the richest and most populous provinces of the empire, was to reorganize what remained and continue calling themselves the Roman Empire. as if nothing significant had occurred. This was psychological resilience, bordering on delusion. Egypt alone had provided a third of Constantinople's grain supply and a huge portion of imperial tax revenue. Syria contained Antioch, one of Christianity's most important cities. Jerusalem was the holiest city in Christendom. Losing these territories was like losing the heart of the empire. Emperor Heraclius, who had spent the early part of his reign, 610 to 641 Anno Domini, reconquering these same territories from the Persians, watched helplessly as Muslim armies undid decades of Byzantine military success in less than a decade. The Byzantine response was to implement the theme system, a military administrative reorganization that turned the empire into a series of fortified military districts. Each theme was governed by a military commander, who was responsible for both civil administration and defense against Muslim raids. This system worked remarkably well for what remained of the empire. The themes in Anatolia, the Balkans, and southern Italy successfully resisted Muslim conquest for centuries. But the psychological adjustment required was enormous. The Byzantines had to accept that they were no longer a Mediterranean superpower, but a regional kingdom defending the approaches to Constantinople. Most remarkably, the Byzantines maintained their claim to be the legitimate Roman Empire throughout this territorial collapse. Imperial documents continued to reference provinces that had been lost to Islam. Byzantine legal codes still claimed authority over Egypt and Syria centuries after Muslim conquest. The empire's survival strategy became defensive rather than expansionist. Instead of reconquering lost territories, the Byzantines focused on preventing further losses while maintaining the fiction that their defeats were temporary setbacks, rather than permanent transformations. Fact number 3. The Persians fought Romans for 400 years. Then both empires collapsed in one generation. The Persian-Byzantine Wars, which had dominated Eastern Mediterranean politics since the 3rd century, came to an abrupt and unexpected conclusion in the 7th century, when both empires discovered they had exhausted themselves fighting each other just in time for a third party to conquer them both. The final Persian-Byzantine War, 602 to 628 Anno Domini, was the most devastating in the series. Persian armies conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Anatolia, besieging Constantinople itself in 626 Anno Domini. For a moment it looked like the Sassanid Empire might finally destroy its Roman rival after 4 centuries of intermittent warfare. Emperor Heraclius launched one of history's most remarkable comebacks, invading Persia itself and forcing the Persians to withdraw from all conquered territories. By 628 Anno Domini, the Byzantines had restored their eastern frontier, and the Persian Empire was in political chaos following the assassination of King Khosrow II. Both empires celebrated their survival, rebuilt their armies, and prepared for the next round of their eternal conflict. Instead, Muslim armies appeared on their borders and conquered both empires with shocking ease. The Persians, who had survived Alexander the Great, Parthian invasions, and 4 centuries of Roman warfare, were completely destroyed by Arab armies between 637 and 651 Anno Domini. The last Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, fled from battlefield to battlefield until he was murdered by his own subjects in 651 Anno Domini. The Byzantines lost 2/3 of their territory to the same Arab armies in roughly the same time period. The eastern provinces that Heraclius had spent decades reconquering from the Persians were lost to Islam within 20 years of their restoration to Byzantine control. The Persian-Byzantine wars had been so destructive that both empires were militarily and financially exhausted when the Muslim expansion began. Provinces that had been devastated by decades of warfare often welcomed Arab conquest as preferable to continued Persian-Byzantine fighting. Fact number 4. The Arabs conquered the world using other people's administrative systems. The early Islamic conquests succeeded not just because of military brilliance, but because the Arabs were remarkably pragmatic about adopting and adapting existing governmental systems rather than trying to impose purely Arab administrative structures. In Egypt, the Arabs kept the Byzantine tax system, but appointed Muslim governors. In Persia, they maintained Sassanid administrative divisions while installing Arab military commanders. In Syria, they preserved Roman law for Christian subjects while governing Muslims according to Islamic legal principles. This administrative flexibility was revolutionary. Most conquerors throughout history had either imposed their own systems, usually unsuccessfully, or been absorbed by the civilizations they conquered. The Arabs created a third option, maintaining local administrative structures while gradually Islamizing the ruling class. The process was gradual and voluntary in most areas. Local elites who converted to Islam were incorporated into the new administration. Christians and Jews who remained in their traditional faiths paid additional taxes but kept their property and legal systems. Peasants and artisans often found their daily lives unchanged, except for having Muslim rather than Byzantine or Persian rulers. Most remarkably, the Arabs preserved and translated the scholarly traditions of conquered territories. Greek scientific and philosophical texts were translated into Arabic in Baghdad. Persian administrative manuals were adapted for Islamic use. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became the greatest center of learning in the world, preserving classical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. This cultural synthesis created Islamic civilization as a genuine fusion of Arab, Persian, Byzantine, and classical traditions, rather than a purely Arab cultural system imposed on conquered populations. Fact number 5. A Christian monk helped invent Islam by accident. The Nestorian Christian communities of Arabia played a crucial role in shaping early Islamic theology, often in ways that neither Christians nor Muslims fully recognized at the time. Nestorian Christianity, considered heretical by both Byzantine and Roman churches, had found refuge in Arabia among Arab tribes who appreciated its less hierarchical structure and its emphasis on Jesus' humanity rather than his divinity. Many Arab Christians were familiar with both Christian theology and Jewish traditions. When Muhammad began preaching in Mecca, his early teachings incorporated elements that were familiar to these Christian Arab communities: monotheism, prophetic revelation, final judgment, and moral codes emphasizing charity and social justice. Some scholars argue that early Islam represented a synthesis of Arab tribal traditions with Christian and Jewish theological concepts. The relationship between early Islam and Arabian Christianity was complex and often cooperative. Some Christian tribes allied with Muslim communities against their common pagan enemies. Christian merchants continued to trade with Muslim communities. Some Christian scholars participated in early Islamic theological discussions. However, as Islam developed its own distinct theological identity, the relationship became more competitive. The Muslim conquest of Christian territories led to mass conversions, often motivated more by political and economic advantages than by theological conviction. By the end of the 7th century, Christianity had largely disappeared from Arabia, while remaining a significant minority religion in conquered Byzantine and Persian territories. The Arabian Christian communities that had helped shape early Islamic thought had been absorbed into the expanding Muslim world. Fact number 6. The Umayyad Caliphate became more Roman than Byzantium. The Umayyad Caliphate, which ruled the Islamic world from Damascus from 661 to 750 Anno Domini, created a governmental system that was remarkably similar to the late Roman Empire, complete with imperial ceremonies, bureaucratic hierarchies, and monumental architecture. This transformation was so profound that in many ways, the Umayyads became more Roman than their Byzantine contemporaries. The Umayyads ruled from Damascus, a former Byzantine provincial capital, using administrative systems inherited from Byzantine Syria. They minted coins based on Byzantine and Persian models, built palaces that incorporated Roman architectural elements, and maintained diplomatic relations with other powers, using protocols derived from imperial Roman practice. This adoption of Roman traditions wasn't merely superficial. It permeated the very core of Umayyad governance. Most tellingly, the Umayyads developed a court culture that would have been recognizable to any late Roman emperor. The caliph was surrounded by elaborate ceremonial, lived in magnificent palaces, and governed through a complex bureaucracy, staffed by educated officials who often came from former Byzantine or Persian administrative families. This synthesis of Roman imperial tradition with Islamic principles created a unique and powerful governmental structure. The great Mosque of Damascus, built between 705 and 7015 Anno Domini, stands as a testament to this cultural fusion. It incorporated columns and architectural elements from a Roman temple while creating spaces for Islamic worship. Similarly, Umayyad palaces like Khirbat al-Mafjar featured Roman-style baths, mosaics, and architectural layouts, blending classical aesthetics with Islamic sensibilities. This cultural synthesis wasn't accidental. It was deliberate imperial policy. The Umayyads understood that governing a vast multi-ethnic empire required adopting successful imperial traditions. They borrowed freely from Roman, Persian, and Arab precedents while creating something distinctively Islamic. The result was a caliphate that functioned like a traditional empire while maintaining Islamic religious identity. The Umayyads proved that Islamic civilization could be both authentically Muslim and genuinely imperial in the Roman tradition. This fusion of cultures and traditions would have far-reaching consequences, shaping the development of Islamic civilization for centuries to come. Fact number 7. Constantinople survived the apocalypse through better plumbing. The Arab sieges of Constantinople in 674 to 678 and 717 to 718 Anno Domini represented Islam's most serious attempts to eliminate the Byzantine Empire entirely. Both sieges failed, not primarily because of superior Byzantine military prowess, but because Constantinople was the most technically advanced city in the world. The city's survival hinged on infrastructure that other cities simply couldn't match. Constantinople's defenses were legendary. Massive land walls that had never been successfully breached, a protected harbor, and a location that made blockade almost impossible. But what really saved Constantinople was its advanced infrastructure. The city's aqueduct system provided reliable fresh water even during extended sieges, while its granaries could store enough food to survive years of blockade. Most importantly, the imperial arsenal could produce Greek fire, an incendiary weapon that made Byzantine naval superiority decisive in harbor combat. Greek fire was the 7th century's equivalent of nuclear weapons, a technological advantage so significant that it changed the strategic balance. Arab fleets that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean found themselves vulnerable to Byzantine naval attacks, using weapons they couldn't replicate or counter. The failed sieges of Constantinople established the military limits of early Islamic expansion, The Arabs could conquer almost any territory through superior mobility and motivation. But they couldn't take the most heavily fortified city in the world, defended by defenders, fighting for their civilization's survival. Constantinople's survival preserved Byzantine claim to Roman legitimacy, while demonstrating that Islamic expansion wasn't inevitable. The city became a symbol of Christian resistance to Islamic conquest, and a reminder that technological superiority could overcome numerical disadvantage. Constantinople's resilience, rooted in its advanced infrastructure and military technology, would continue to shape the balance of power in the Mediterranean for centuries to come. Fact number 8. The Plague of Justinian. Finally ended, and everyone immediately started fighting. The pandemic that had devastated the Mediterranean world for over a century finally burned itself out in the mid-7th century, just in time for the surviving populations to discover they had enough people left to resume large-scale warfare. The end of this catastrophic plague marked a turning point in Mediterranean history, setting the stage for a new era of conflict and expansion. The demographic recovery was remarkably rapid. Areas that had been depopulated by plague began supporting larger armies within a generation. Trade routes that had been disrupted by population collapse were restored, breathing new life into regional economies. Cities that had shrunk to towns began growing again, fueling urban revival and cultural renaissance. This recovery coincided perfectly with the Islamic expansion, creating a generation of young men who had never experienced the demographic catastrophe of the plague years, but who lived in societies that remembered prosperity and were eager to achieve it again. The end of the plague meant that conquering armies no longer had to worry about occupying territories devastated by disease. Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia were once again rich enough to be worth conquering, and healthy enough to support occupying forces. Most importantly, the demographic recovery meant that religious and political movements could once again mobilize mass popular support. Islam succeeded partly because it emerged at exactly the moment when Arabian and Middle Eastern populations were large enough and healthy enough to support sustained military campaigns. The timing of the plague's end and the subsequent population rebound played a crucial role in shaping the geopolitical landscape of the 7th century and beyond. Fact number 9. Latin died as a living language, and nobody noticed for 200 years. By 700 Anno Domini, the Latin spoken in different parts of Western Europe had evolved into mutually unintelligible dialects that would eventually become French, Spanish, Italian, and other Romance languages. Yet educated Europeans continued to pretend they were all speaking the same language. This linguistic transformation was one of the most profound yet unnoticed changes of the post-Roman world. The transformation happened gradually enough that each generation assumed their Latin was essentially identical to their parents', even as pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar shifted steadily away from classical norms. A peasant in Gaul and a peasant in Spain could no longer understand each other's speech, but their local priests insisted both were speaking corrupted versions of proper Latin. This linguistic fragmentation reflected the broader cultural fragmentation of post-Roman Europe. Without a unified educational system or common administrative language, regional variations became regional languages. The Church maintained Latin as a liturgical language, but even ecclesiastical Latin varied significantly between regions. Fact number 10. Europe became medieval by accident while trying to stay Roman. The most mind-blowing fact about the 7th century is that it created medieval civilization almost entirely by accident. European kingdoms, Islamic caliphates, and the Byzantine Empire All thought they were preserving or restoring classical civilization. Instead, they created something completely new. This unintentional transformation would shape the course of world history for the next millennium. The Franks believed they were protecting Roman Christians while developing feudalism. The Byzantines thought they were maintaining the Roman Empire while creating Orthodox Christianity. The Umayyads assumed they were building a universal empire while establishing Islamic civilization. Everyone was trying to be classical while accidentally being medieval. The transformation was so gradual that no one recognized it was happening. A Byzantine official in 700 Anno Domini would have insisted his empire was identical to the empire of Justinian, despite speaking Greek instead of Latin, using completely different military and administrative systems, and governing territories that bore little resemblance to the classical empire. Similarly, a Frankish king would have claimed to be protecting Roman traditions while ruling through institutions that would have horrified Augustus. An Umayyad caliph would have argued that his empire represented the natural evolution of classical imperial traditions while governing according to principles that classical emperors would have found incomprehensible. The 7th century proved that civilizations can transform completely while maintaining the illusion of continuity. Medieval Europe, the Islamic world, and Byzantium all emerged from the wreckage of the classical world while insisting they were preserving it. 700 out. The ancient world was dead. The medieval world was born, and nobody had noticed the difference.